Dawn broke cold over Tate's auction yard, the smell of manure and fear thick enough to choke on. Aida stood barefoot on the wooden platform, splinters cutting into her soles with every shift of weight. Her dress hung torn at the shoulder, exposing rope burns that circled her wrists like bracelets of shame. 40 men crowded below, tobacco-stained teeth flashing as they assessed her the way they'd assess a lame horse. Vernon Tate gripped his gavel, knuckles white against the wood. "Last Apache woman," he announced, voice carrying across the yard. "No kin, no tribe, no value." Bidding opened slow. $2, shouted a drunk farmer. "3," countered a rail worker. Then silence fell like a stone. Men spit near her feet. One laughed. "Ain't worth chicken feed." Caleb Thornhill stood at the crowd's edge, counting worn bills in his palm. His eyes caught the brand mark on her wrist. Military, not tribal. His jaw tightened. Tate raised the gavel. "Going once." Caleb's hand shot up. $12. The crowd gasped. Tate's smile vanished. "You'll regret charity, Thornhill." Caleb stepped forward through the parting crowd, boots heavy on hard-packed dirt. Men muttered as he passed, but no one met his eyes. He'd lived in this valley long enough that folks knew better than to question him out loud, though their stares said plenty. Tate counted the coins with deliberate slowness, letting each one clink against the wooden table. His fingers were soft, banker's hands that had never worked a plow or mended a fence. When he finished, he pulled a pre-written receipt from his coat pocket and slid it across the table with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Sign here, Thornhill." Caleb took the pen, its metal nib cold against his calloused fingers. The ink smudged where his thumb pressed too hard, but the signature was clear enough. Vernon Tate tucked the receipt into his ledger and handed over a handwritten bill of sale that smelled of cheap paper and cheaper ink. 90 days, Tate said quietly, leaning close enough that only Caleb could hear. "Your mortgage comes due in 90 days. Don't forget what you owe me." Caleb folded the paper without answering and turned toward the platform where Aida stood frozen, eyes fixed on the ground. He approached slowly, stopping 3 feet away so she wouldn't feel cornered. The chains around her wrists caught the morning light as he reached for the lock. "I'm going to take these off," he said, voice low and steady. "Won't hurt you." She flinched when the metal scraped, but he worked the lock open with careful hands, letting the chains fall to the platform with a dull clatter that made the crowd shift uncomfortably. Aida pulled her arms close to her chest, rubbing at the raw skin where iron had bitten deep. Caleb gestured toward his horse tied near the fence. "Can you ride?" She didn't answer, but she walked toward the animal with the kind of exhaustion that came from being awake too many nights in a row. He helped her into the saddle, his hands steady under her elbow, and she climbed up without looking at him once. Her fingers gripped the saddle horn so tight her knuckles went white. He swung up behind her, settling into place with enough distance that she could breathe. The horse shifted beneath them, sensing the tension, and Caleb guided them toward the road that led out of town. Behind them, Tate stood on his porch, stroking the ledger book like a man petting a loyal dog. The ride to the ranch took an hour, the only sound the rhythmic thud of hooves and the wind pushing through dry grass. Aida's shoulders stayed rigid the entire way, her back straight as a rifle barrel despite the trembling in her arms. Caleb didn't try to make conversation. Words felt too heavy for whatever this silence held. When the cabin finally came into view, a small structure near a split-rail fence, corral half fallen, shed leaning to one side, Caleb felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like an old coat he'd forgotten he was wearing. He stopped the horse by the porch and slid down first, then held out a hand. Aida hesitated, studying his palm as if it might close into a fist. Finally, she placed her fingers against his, just long enough to steady herself before pulling away quickly, like touch itself could burn. Inside, the cabin smelled of dry wood, and the faint trace of last night's beans still stuck to the pot near the stove. One room, plain but clean, with a bed against the far wall and a table with 2 chairs. Caleb lit the stove, coaxing flame from kindling until smoke curled upward and the scent of burning cedar filled the space. He ladled beans into a tin bowl and set it on the table, then stepped back to give her room. She stared at the food, eyes flicking from the bowl to him and back again, waiting for some trap to spring. "Eat," he said simply, then moved to the far side of the cabin and busied himself checking the rifle by the door. After a long moment, she sat. She picked up the spoon with shaking fingers and ate fast at first, like someone who expected the bowl to disappear, then slower, when she realized no one was going to take it from her. When she finished, she set the spoon down gently, almost like the noise might anger him. Caleb noticed the way she kept pulling at her torn dress, trying to hide the exposed skin at her shoulder. He moved to the trunk by the bed and pulled out a clean shirt, soft from years of washing, and laid it on the quilt without comment. "I'll check the barn," he said, heading for the door. "You can change." He stepped outside into the cold air and closed the door behind him, giving her the privacy she needed, but wouldn't ask for. The wind rattled through the corral fence, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out to the fading light. Inside, Aida stood slowly and reached for the shirt with trembling hands. She touched the charred paper edge peeking from her small bundle on the floor, then yanked her hand back like it had burned her. Morning came, with the kind of silence that made a man notice every small sound, the creak of floorboards, the pop of wood settling in the stove, the shallow breathing of someone who'd forgotten how to sleep without fear. Caleb woke on the floor where he'd made his bed, back against the wall near the door, rifle within arm's reach. He'd spent most of the night listening to the road, waiting for hoofbeats that never came. Aida sat at the table already, wrapped in his shirt and the blanket he'd given her. She'd folded the torn dress into a neat square and placed it beside her bundle. Her hands rested in her lap, still and watchful. Caleb stood slowly, his joints protesting the cold floor and the years he'd spent pretending his body wasn't aging. He poured water from the jug into a tin cup and set it in front of her before moving to the stove to warm yesterday's beans. She drank without looking at him, and when she finished, she reached for his torn shirt, the one he'd left draped over the chair the night before. Her fingers moved with surprising precision, threading a needle she'd found in the mending kit on the shelf. The needle pulled through fabric with a soft whisper, each stitch placed with the kind of care that came from muscle memory. Caleb watched her work while he ate, noticing the patterns she used, an Apache technique he recognized from his years in the territories. The stitches formed a zigzag that would hold stronger than a straight seam. She didn't ask permission to mend it, she just did it, like repaying a debt too large to name. When she finished, she set the shirt down and met his eyes for the first time since they'd left town. "Water," she said, voice rough from disuse. He handed her the bucket and gestured toward the well outside. She took it and stepped onto the porch, moving with the careful awareness of someone who'd learned to map every exit before entering a room. Caleb used the moment alone to check her bundle. He shouldn't have. It wasn't his business, but something about the way she'd touched that charred paper last night made his instincts flare. He unfolded the edges carefully, finding a burned blanket, a small silver cross, and a piece of paper folded so many times the creases had nearly torn through. He opened it slowly, and his breath caught in his throat. It was an Army report, official seal still visible despite the scorch marks. The header read, "Thornhill Creek Raid, April 1876, civilian casualties 47. Below that, a list of names in neat handwriting, and at the bottom, the commanding officer's signature, Captain Edward Thornhill, his uncle. Caleb's hands started shaking. He'd heard stories about the raid. Everyone had, but he'd never known Edward had led it, never knew his own blood had been responsible for... The door opened. Aida stood in the threshold, bucket in hand, her eyes locked on the paper in his grip. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then her face changed, something cold and hard sliding into place behind her eyes. "Thornhill," she said, the words sharp as broken glass. She set the bucket down with a splash. "I know this name." Caleb tried to speak, but his throat had closed up. "Your blood killed mine," she continued, each word deliberate and weighted. "Your family, my family, all gone." He set the paper down on the table like it might explode. "I didn't know," he said, voice hoarse. "I swear to God, I didn't—" "You carry the name," she interrupted. "The name that burned my village, killed my father, my brother." Her hands clenched into fists. "And now I am here, in your house, wearing your shirt." Caleb felt the full weight of inherited sin pressing down on his shoulders. There were no words that could erase what Edward had done, no apology big enough to matter. He'd bought her freedom with $12, but his family had stolen everything else. Before he could find something, anything, to say, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the morning air, multiple horses moving fast. Both of them froze. Caleb grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. Through the gap in the shutters, he saw Vernon Tate riding up with the territorial sheriff beside him and 2 deputies flanking them. Tate's face wore the kind of satisfaction that came from holding winning cards. "Thornhill!" Tate's voice boomed across the yard. "That woman's evidence in a federal case. Army wants her back for questioning about stolen government property." Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked at Aida, saw the terror flooding back into her eyes, the same look she'd had on the auction platform. "She stays," he called back through the window. The sheriff dismounted, boots hitting the dirt with authority. "This ain't a request, Caleb. Federal warrant supersedes your bill of sale. She's coming with us." Tate grinned from his saddle. "Law wants her back. Your piece of paper don't mean freedom, just means you wasted $12. Aita's breathing quickened, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so hard the wood creaked. Caleb could see her calculating distances. Door to window, window to tree line, how fast she could run before they caught her. He stepped between her and the door, rifle held loose, but ready. Nobody's taking her anywhere. Outside, Tate's laugh carried on the wind. "Then I reckon we got ourselves a problem, Thornhill." The standoff held for 3 heartbeats before a new voice cut through the tension. "Hold on now." Reverend Samuel Moss rode up from the South Road, his old mare moving at a pace that suggested he'd pushed her hard to get here. The Reverend was 62, with a weathered face that had seen too many funerals and not enough weddings. He dismounted slowly, Bible clutched in one hand, and positioned himself directly between Tate's group and Caleb's porch. "Sheriff," Moss said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from standing at pulpits for 40 years. "Before you go breaking down doors, you ought to know, territorial law's got something to say about this." The sheriff shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable. "Reverend, federal warrant trumps. Christian sanctuary," Moss interrupted, holding up one hand. "Section 12 of the Territorial Code says baptized persons can't be seized from a homestead without proper judicial review. That's 3 days minimum, not counting Sundays." Tate's face reddened. "She's a heathen, Moss. No church record exists for... You certain about that?" The Reverend's eyes were sharp despite his age. He let the question hang in the air, and Caleb noticed the way Moss's hand tightened on his Bible, like a man holding a secret he wasn't ready to reveal. The sheriff rubbed his jaw, clearly doing calculations. "You saying you got proof of baptism, Reverend?" Moss met his gaze steadily. "I'm saying the law requires you give me 48 hours to search the records. If I can produce documentation, she stays put until a judge reviews the case proper. If I can't..." He let the sentence trail off. Tate's horse stamped, sensing its rider's agitation. "This is nonsense. She's Apache. The law don't care what you think she is," Moss said quietly. "It cares what I can prove she is." The sheriff looked between Moss and Tate, then at Caleb's cabin, where the rifle barrel was just visible in the window. Finally, he sighed. 2 days, Reverend. Sunday's in 3 days anyway. So that gives you until Monday morning. You produce a baptism record by then, we'll take it to Judge Carver. You don't... He let the threat hang unfinished. Tate started to protest, but the sheriff held up a hand. "That's the law, Vernon. I ain't starting a gunfight over paperwork." He wheeled his horse around, and the deputies followed, leaving Tate alone on the road. The banker's eyes burned with cold fury as he stared at the cabin. "Monday morning," he said, voice low enough that only Moss could hear. "And when you come up empty, Thornhill loses more than just the woman." He yanked his reins and rode off, dust rising in his wake. Moss waited until the hoofbeats faded before approaching the porch. Caleb opened the door slowly, rifle still in hand, and Aida stood behind him, pressed against the far wall. "Appreciate that," Caleb said. Moss stepped inside, his boots scraping on the threshold. The cabin smelled of beans and wood smoke and fear poorly hidden. He looked past Caleb to Aida, studying her face with an intensity that made her shrink back further. "What's your mother's name?" he asked gently. Aida's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but something in the Reverend's tone made her answer. "Maria." Moss's breath caught. "Maria Naltza?" She nodded slowly, and the Reverend's hand went to his chest like he'd been struck. He pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his forehead, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. "I baptized your mother," he said quietly. "Easter Sunday, 1862. She came to the church in secret, afraid her husband would be angry, said she wanted God's protection for the child she was carrying." His eyes met Aida's. "That child was you." The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Aida stared at him, her lips moving but no sound coming out. Caleb found his voice first. "You got records?" "Should have." Moss wiped his face again. "Church keeps baptism ledgers going back to 58. They're in the archive room, buried under 16 years of dust and mice droppings, but they're there." He looked at Aida again. "I remember your mother. She had your eyes." "Why you never speak before?" Aida asked, her English halting but clear enough. Moss's face crumpled with something that looked like shame. Because I was a coward, he said simply. When the raids came, when they took your people, I told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself I was just a preacher, that I couldn't stop soldiers. But the truth is, I was afraid. He gripped his Bible tighter. I've been afraid a long time. Maybe it's time I stopped. Caleb set his rifle against the wall. You think you can find that record? I'll tear that archive apart board by board if I have to, Moss said. But Caleb, you need to understand, even if I find it, Tate's got connections. He'll try to get around it somehow. Judge Carver owes him money from 3 failed loans. Then we'll need more than just paper, Caleb said. A knock at the door made all 3 of them tense. Caleb reached for his rifle, but Moss held up a hand. Easy, I sent word to someone on my way here. He opened the door to reveal Doc Harriet Pruitt standing on the porch, medical bag in hand. She was 45, practical as nails, with gray streaking through the hair she kept pinned tight under a worn hat. She'd delivered half the babies in the valley and buried a quarter of the men, which gave her a kind of authority even the sheriff respected. Reverend said you might need a medical examination documented, she said, looking past them to Aida. That woman's got injuries that should be recorded proper. Aida pressed herself flatter against the wall, eyes wide. Doc Pruitt saw the fear and softened her voice. I'm not here to hurt you, girl. But if Tate's claiming federal jurisdiction, we need evidence those soldiers treated you illegal. Army can't mark civilians as property. That's against the Articles of War. She held up her bag. I document what I see, write it official, seal it with my physician's stamp. That carries weight in territorial court. Caleb looked at Aida. Your choice. Nobody's forcing anything. Aida's eyes moved between all of them, the Reverend with his guilt-heavy shoulders, the doctor with her practical determination, Caleb with his inherited sins. Finally, she pulled back her sleeve, exposing the brand mark on her wrist. Doc Pruitt stepped closer, pulling spectacles from her pocket. She examined the scar in the lamplight, her face going hard as stone. That's an Army property brand, she said quietly. I've seen it before, on equipment and livestock. She looked up at Aida. When did they do this to you? After the raid, Aida whispered. They say I am contraband, federal property. Doc Pruitt's jaw clenched. She pulled out a notebook and began writing with swift, angry strokes. 2 days passed in a blur of tense preparation. Moss tore through the church archives like a man possessed, emerging with ink-stained fingers and dust coating his clothes. Doc Pruitt examined every scar on Aida's body, cataloging each mark with clinical precision that barely masked her fury. Caleb kept watch, rifle always within reach, sleeping in 2-hour shifts by the door. On the 3rd morning, just as dawn broke gray and cold, the first crack appeared in their fragile defense. Caleb rode into town to buy salt and cornmeal, necessities they couldn't go without. The general store fell silent when he entered, conversations dying mid-sentence. Mrs. Henderson, who'd sold him supplies for 8 years without fail, wouldn't meet his eyes. Need 10 pounds of cornmeal, he said, setting coins on the counter. She wiped her hands on her apron, fingers twisting the fabric. Can't sell to you, Caleb. What? Mr. Tate came by yesterday. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Said anyone who does business with you is harboring a fugitive. Said the bank might reconsider their loans. Caleb felt cold wash through his chest. He looked around the store, at old Samuel Tucker, who owed Tate $300, at the Morrison brothers, whose ranch mortgage came due next month, at half a dozen other faces suddenly finding somewhere else to look. I see, he said quietly, picking up his coins. The metal felt heavier than it should. Outside, he noticed the change immediately. People crossed the street to avoid him. The blacksmith, who'd shod his horses for 6 years, was suddenly too busy to talk. Even the saloon, where a man could usually buy a drink regardless of his sins, had a new sign, right to refuse service. Tate was everywhere and nowhere, his influence spreading through town like poison in a well. Caleb rode back to the ranch, his saddlebag empty, and found Reverend Moss waiting on the porch. The old man's face was pale, and he held a crumpled piece of paper in shaking hands. Found the baptism record, Moss said without preamble. Maria Naltza, baptized Easter 1862, mother of Aida. He should have sounded triumphant. Instead, he sounded defeated. That's good news, Caleb said slowly. Got some bad news to go with it. Moss handed him the paper. A foreclosure notice, official bank seal at the top. Tate's calling in your mortgage early. Says you violated the moral character clause by harboring a federal fugitive. Caleb read the notice twice, hoping the words would change. They didn't. Says here I got 30 days to pay $180. You got that much? Not even close. Caleb had maybe $40 saved, and that was before buying Aida. The $12 he'd spent at auction was supposed to come from his winter feed budget. He'd been planning to make it up by selling 3 steers in December, but that still wouldn't have covered the full mortgage, just the regular payment. Moss sat heavily on the porch step. There's more. Tate's been spreading word around that you stole government property. Half the town thinks you're some kind of criminal now. The other half's too scared to say otherwise. Aida appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket despite the shirt and dress Doc Pruitt had brought her. She'd been listening, her English good enough now to understand the shape of the trap closing around them. I go, she said simply. You keep your house. No. Caleb's voice came out harder than he intended. That's not happening. Your land, your home, I am nothing but... You're not nothing. He turned to face her fully. And this isn't just about you anymore. He pulled out the army report from his pocket, the one he'd been carrying since the day he found it. My family did this to yours. My uncle led the raid that killed your father. I can't fix that, but I'll be damned if I let Tate finish what Edward started. Aida stared at him, something complicated moving behind her eyes. Anger and confusion and the first fragile threads of trust being tested. Before anyone could speak, Doc Pruitt came riding up fast, her horse lathered with sweat. She dismounted in a rush, nearly dropping her medical bag. We've got a problem, she announced, pulling out a folded document. I went to file my medical report with the territorial clerk this morning. Found out Tate filed something first. She spread the paper on the porch rail. It was an affidavit, signed by 3 men Caleb recognized from the auction, the drunk farmer, the rail worker, and a drifter who'd been hanging around town looking for work. They're swearing under oath that Aida stole army supplies during the raid, Doc said, claiming she was caught with federal blankets and silver. Says she was arrested legally as a thief, not as contraband. That's a lie, Caleb said. Course it's a lie. But it's a signed lie, and Tate's using it to get a federal warrant issued. Doc's voice was tight with barely controlled rage. Judge Carver's already approved it. Sheriff's got orders to arrest her at dawn tomorrow. Moss stood up slowly, his knees cracking. Then we move up the timeline. I call a church gathering for tonight. Tonight? Caleb looked at him. What good's that gonna do? Territorial law says a congregation can petition for sanctuary review if enough witnesses testify to moral character. We get 30 people to vouch for her. It buys us another week while the territorial court reviews the case. Moss's jaw set with determination. Tate's counting on fear keeping people silent. Maybe it's time we found out if this valley's got any spine left. Reverend, Doc said quietly, most folks in this town owe Tate money. They won't risk their livelihoods. Then we find the ones who don't. Moss looked at Aida, really looked at her, this young woman who'd survived massacre and chains and humiliation, who stood on a porch in borrowed clothes refusing to run. Sometimes you got to ask people to be better than they think they are. Caleb felt something shift in the air, some decision crystallizing. He turned to Aida. You got anything else in that bundle? Anything that might help prove who you are? She hesitated, then disappeared inside. When she returned, she held a piece of charred paper, edges blackened and crumbling. She unfolded it with the care of someone handling something sacred. My father's, she said, offering it to Caleb. He took it gently, and his heart nearly stopped. It was a land deed, official territorial seal at the top, dated 1871. The text was barely legible through smoke damage, but he could make out the key words. Chief Naultz, legal owner, 200 acres, southwest quarter, Moss Creek Valley. His hands started shaking. This is my ranch, he said hoarsely. The land I'm living on. The land Tate sold me. He looked up at Aida. Your father owned this legally, before the raid, before any of this. Moss leaned in to read the deed, his face going pale. If this is legitimate, if we can verify it, then Tate's been committing land fraud. He sold you property that was never his to sell. And if we prove that, Doc added slowly, His entire mortgage on this place is invalid. Aida's voice was quiet but clear. My father filed with territorial office, made legal proper, white man's way. Her eyes met Caleb's. This land is mine, was always mine. The four of them stood in silence as the full weight of the revelation settled. Tate hadn't just stolen Aida's freedom, he'd stolen her inheritance, and in doing so he'd built his entire financial empire on a foundation of fraud. He knows, Caleb said suddenly. That's why he's pushing so hard. If she stays free long enough to prove ownership, his whole operation collapses. Then we don't give him a choice, Ma said. Tonight, church gathering, we bring everything, the baptism record, the medical evidence, and this. He pointed at the deed. We make it public before he can bury it. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats drifted on the wind. In the distance, Caleb could see dust rising from the road, riders heading toward town, too many to count. Tate was moving his pieces into position. They had 6 hours before sunset, when Moss planned to ring the church bell calling the community to witness. 6 hours to prepare for a confrontation that would either free Aida or seal all their fates. Caleb spent the first hour teaching her to read the deed. They sat at the table, his finger tracing each word while she repeated the sounds, her voice growing stronger with each pass. The lamplight caught the charred edges of the paper, making shadows dance across words that meant everything. Legal owner, she said carefully, then again with more confidence. Legal owner. That's right. Caleb moved his finger down. What's this word? Naltz. Her throat caught on her father's name. My father. He watched her face as understanding deepened, not just the words, but what they meant. She wasn't a refugee begging for shelter. She was a landowner whose property had been stolen. The difference between those two truths was everything. When she could read the full deed without help, stumbling only slightly over southwest quarter, Caleb pulled out a pencil and a scrap of clean paper. Write your father's name, he said. Her hand shook as she gripped the pencil. The letters came out crooked at first. N too tall, a leaning wrong, but she kept going, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. When she finished, she stared at the word like it might disappear if she looked away. Naltzi. Good, Caleb said quietly. Now, write yours. She hesitated, the pencil hovering over the paper. Then slowly, she formed the letters. Aita Naltze. Her breath hitched. It was the first time she'd written her own name in English, the first time she'd claimed her identity in the language of the men who'd tried to erase it. The ink sat dark and permanent on the page, proof that she existed, that she had a name and a father and a right to the ground beneath her feet. Caleb gave her a moment, then stood and moved to the corner where his tools leaned against the wall. He pulled out a worn leather case and opened it, revealing surveying equipment his wife had inherited from her father, compass, measuring chain, boundary markers. Come on, he said. I want to show you something. They walked the property line together, Aida wrapped in the coat Doc had brought, Caleb carrying the deed and pointing out landmarks. Here was the creek that marked the eastern boundary, there, the stand of cottonwoods that defined the north corner. The old stone markers placed by surveyors in 1871 still stood where her father had watched them planted. Your father knew what he was doing, Caleb said, crouching by one of the stones. These markers are placed proper, legal-like. He didn't just claim this land. He proved it was his. Aita knelt beside him, fingers tracing the carved numbers in the stone. He wanted safe place. For my mother, for me. Her English was halting but clear. He thought white man's paper would protect us. It should have, Caleb said, anger tightening his voice. It damn well should have. They reached the southwestern corner where the forge stood, a simple stone structure with a cold fire pit and tools hanging from iron hooks. The branding iron rested among them, its end shaped like a T for Thornhill, the mark Caleb used on his cattle. Aida stopped when she saw it, her hand going unconsciously to her wrist where the scar lived. We can get rid of it, Caleb offered. Throw it in the creek, bury it. No, her voice was firm. She stepped closer, reaching out to touch the cold metal. This is yours, your mark. Your father's before you, yes? My wife's father, actually. But yeah, been in use 20 years. She looked at him, something calculating in her eyes. You use this to say, this cow is mine. Mark it so no one can steal. That's the idea. Men marked me same way. Say, this woman is property. She gripped the iron's handle, knuckles white. But this iron is different. You use it honest. You don't steal cows, you raise them. You don't take what isn't yours. Caleb wasn't sure where she was going, but he let her work through it. This tool. She struggled for words, then switched to broken phrases he had to piece together. This tool honest. The men who marked me, they were not. The tool is not evil, the hand that holds it, that makes it good or bad. She looked at the forge, then back at him. We melt it, make something new, something that means, I choose, not taken, not marked, choose. Understanding dawned slowly. You want me to forge something from it? She nodded. You melt it, break it, make it new. She placed her hand over her heart. Make it mean freedom, not slave. Caleb looked at the branding iron, this tool that had marked his cattle and someone else's, some nameless soldiers, that had marked her flesh. There was a symmetry to it, a kind of poetry that felt right in a way he couldn't fully explain. I can do that, he said, but it'll take time, and we got a church meeting in 4 hours. After, she said, after we fight, after we win, her chin lifted. Then you make it new. They walked back toward the cabin as shadows lengthened across the valley. In the distance, Caleb could see riders on the horizon, not coming closer, just watching. Tate's men, keeping track of their movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. Inside, Reverend Moss had arrived with Doc Pruitt. They'd spread papers across the table, the baptism record, medical reports, the land deed, organizing evidence like ammunition. Folks are scared, Moss said without preamble. Talked to 15 families. Most said they can't risk it. But I got 5 who'll come. 5 witnesses willing to testify. 5's not 30, Caleb said. No, Moss agreed. But it's 5 more than Tate thinks we'll get, and sometimes 5 brave souls are enough to shame the cowards into finding their spine. Doc Pruitt checked her watch. 3 hours till sunset. We should head to the church, get set up before anyone has second thoughts. Aida stepped forward, the charred deed clutched in her hands. I speak tonight. Tell them my father's name. Tell them this land is mine. The 3 of them looked at her, this young woman who'd been silent and terrified 3 days ago, now standing straight-backed and determined. Yes, Caleb said simply. You tell them everything. The church bell rang out across the valley as the sun touched the horizon, its sound carrying through cold air like a summons that couldn't be ignored. Moss Creek Chapel stood on a small rise, white paint peeling from weathered boards, its steeple casting a long shadow across the cemetery where 3 generations of valley folk lay buried. Caleb helped Aida down from the wagon, her hands steady now despite everything riding on the next few hours. She wore the simple dress Doc had brought, her hair braided back in a style that mixed Apache tradition with frontier practicality. The charred deed was folded carefully in her pocket, and she kept one hand pressed against it like a talisman. Inside, the chapel smelled of old wood and candle wax and the dust that settled on unused hymnals. Moss lit lamps along the walls, their glow pushing back shadows but doing nothing to warm the space. Doc Pruitt arranged their evidence on a small table near the pulpit, baptism ledger open to the relevant page, medical reports stacked neat, survey maps spread flat. The first to arrive was old Thomas Garrett, who'd fought in the Mexican War and had been saying for 20 years that he was too ornery to die. He took a seat in the front pew without speaking, his presence itself a statement. Then came Sarah Mitchell and her teenage son, both of them thin from a hard season, but dressed in their Sunday best. Sarah's husband had died 2 years back, leaving her with a small farm she ran alone. She owed Tate nothing, which made her braver than most. By the time full darkness fell, 7 people sat in the pews. Not the 30 they'd hoped for, but more than the 0 Tate had counted on. 7 witnesses in a valley of 200 souls. 7 people willing to risk everything. Then the door opened and Sheriff Morrison walked in, his deputy behind him. The room tensed immediately, hands moving toward pockets where men kept knives or the women clutched their shawls tighter. Easy, the sheriff said, holding up both hands. I'm here as witness, not law. What happens in a church gathering ain't my jurisdiction unless someone breaks the peace. He looked directly at Caleb. I owe Tate money, same as half this valley. But I also swore an oath to uphold territorial law, and that includes the right to sanctuary petition, so I'm here to make sure everything's done proper. Moss nodded slowly. Appreciate that, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet, Morrison said, taking a seat in the back. Tate knows about this meeting. He'll be here soon, and he won't come alone. As if summoned, the sound of multiple horses echoed outside. Caleb moved to the window and saw Vernon Tate dismounting along with 6 men. 3 he recognized as the ones who'd signed the false affidavits. The others, hired muscle from out of territory. Tate wore his finest suit, the kind he saved for foreclosure auctions and land claims. He strode through the church doors like he owned them, his eyes sweeping the sparse gathering with barely concealed contempt. "This is your congregation, Moss? 7 people and a woman who can barely speak English?" "This is a lawful sanctuary petition," Moss said from the pulpit, his voice carrying the authority of decades behind it. "Under territorial code, we're here to present evidence regarding Aida Naltza's legal status and right to remain on her property." "Her property?" Tate laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet space. "That woman's a fugitive with a federal warrant. She doesn't own anything except the crimes she's charged with." "Then you won't mind hearing the evidence?" Doc Pruitt said sharply. "Duh." She stood and held up the baptism ledger. "Maria Naltza, baptized Easter 1862, mother of Aida. That makes Aida a baptized Christian by birth, which means your auction violated territorial law regarding the sale of Christian persons." Tate's jaw tightened. "Baptism of a dead woman doesn't prove—" "Here's what it proves," Doc interrupted, pulling out her medical reports. "These scars on her wrists and arms are U.S. Army property brands. I've documented them with physician's seal. Branding civilians is a federal crime under the Articles of War. Those soldiers broke the law when they marked her." One of Tate's hired men shifted uncomfortably, but Tate himself didn't flinch. "Army discipline is outside territorial jurisdiction. You've got nothing." Aida stood then, the movement drawing every eye. She walked to the front of the church, her steps steady despite the trembling Caleb could see in her hands. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, each English word carefully chosen. "My name is Aida Naltza. My father was Chief Naltza. In 1871, he bought land, legal, proper, white man's way." She pulled the charred deed from her pocket and unfolded it with reverent care. "He filed paper with territory, made it his, made it mine." She held up the deed for everyone to see, and Caleb watched Tate's face drain of color. "This land," Aida continued, pointing at the survey description, "Southwest Quarter, Moss Creek Valley, 200 acres, my father's land, my land." She turned to face Tate directly. "You sold what was not yours. You are thief." The church fell absolutely silent. Even Tate's men seemed to have stopped breathing. Tate recovered quickly, his smile returning like a knife being drawn. "That paper's meaningless. Apache land claims were nullified after the raids. Territorial Statute 42. Doesn't apply to legally purchased and filed property," a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. Judge William Carver stood in the threshold, his traveling coat dusty from the road. He was 68, with silver hair and the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile somewhere between his first and 100th difficult verdict. "I rode out here because my clerk mentioned something interesting," the judge continued, stepping inside. "Seems there's a dispute about a land deed, and since I'm the one who has to rule on the federal warrant, I figured I ought to hear all the evidence before making a decision." His eyes fixed on Tate. "Especially evidence about who actually owns the property in question." Tate's face went from pale to red. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "So is selling the same parcel of land twice, Vernon," the judge said quietly, "which is what my clerk found when she went through the territorial records this afternoon. Southwest Quarter, Moss Creek Valley, sold to Caleb Thornhill in 1877 and to the Rio Grande Railway Company in 1876. He pulled out a folded document. "Both sales bearing your signature, both claiming clear title." The hired men behind Tate began backing toward the door. "Now," Judge Carver said, "let's see that deed the young woman's holding." Aida handed the deed to Judge Carver with both hands, the gesture formal and deliberate. He took it carefully, spreading it on the table under the lamplight. His fingers traced the charred edges, the faded ink, the territorial seal that had survived fire and time and theft. The silence stretched while he read every word, his eyes moving slowly across the damaged document. Moss stood beside him, ready to vouch for its authenticity. Doc Pruitt had her medical reports in hand. The 7 witnesses sat frozen in their pews, barely daring to breathe. Finally, Carver looked up. "This deed predates both of Tate's sales by 5 years. Or it. If it's genuine, and the seal appears legitimate, then neither sale had legal standing. The land was never his to sell." "That paper's been tampered with," Tate said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Look at it. Burned, damaged. Could have been forged yesterday. Could have been, Carver agreed. Except the Territorial Filing Office keeps duplicate records. He pulled out another document from his coat. My clerk pulled the original registration this afternoon. Chief Nault's, April 1871. 200 acres purchased from the Territorial Land Office for $250 cash. Witnessed, notarized, sealed. He looked at Tate with cold eyes. You want to explain how you sold land that had a clear legal owner? Tate's throat worked, but no words came out. Caleb stood slowly, feeling the weight of what he had to say pressing down on his shoulders. I need to speak my piece, Your Honor, before this goes any further. Carver nodded. Go ahead, Mr. Thornhill. Caleb moved to the front of the church, standing beside Ayita. He could feel the eyes of everyone watching. The 7 brave souls who'd come, the sheriff taking mental notes, Tate's men calculating whether to run, and Ayita herself, standing so close he could hear her breathing. My name is Caleb Thornhill, he began, his voice rough, and I need to tell you about my uncle, Edward Thornhill, Captain Edward Thornhill. He pulled the Army report from his pocket, the same one he'd found in Ayita's bundle, and held it up for everyone to see. April 1876, Thornhill Creek Raid. My uncle led the cavalry unit that attacked Ayita's village. 47 civilians killed, including her father, Chief Naultza, her brother, most of her family. His hands shook as he read the names aloud, each one a weight added to scales he'd never known he was carrying. The report says they were hunting hostiles, but these names, these are children, women, old men. Sarah Mitchell made a soft sound of distress. Thomas Garrett's jaw tightened. I didn't know, Caleb continued. I swear, before God and everyone here, I didn't know Edward had done this. Didn't know until 3 days ago when I found this report in Ayita's belongings. He looked at the gathered witnesses. But not knowing doesn't change what happened. My blood killed hers. My family destroyed her family. And then, his voice broke, then I had the audacity to think I was doing her a favor by buying her freedom. He turned to face Ayita fully. I paid $12 for you at that auction. Thought I was saving you. But the truth is, I bought you with money I paid Vernon Tate for land he stole from your father. I've been living on your property, working your soil, using your water. Everything I thought was mine, it was yours all along. Tears ran down Ayita's face, but she didn't look away. So I'm saying this public, in front of witnesses and a judge, Caleb said. This land belongs to Ayita Naultza. The ranch, the house, everything. It's hers by right. I'm offering to leave, walk away, let her have back what never should have been taken. No, Ayita said, the words sharp and clear. Caleb blinked. What? Your uncle's sin, not yours. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You did not kill my father. You did not burn my village. You carry the name, but you are not him. She placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. Your heart is different. Your hands are clean. But the land is mine, she finished. Yes, my father's land. My land. She looked out at the small gathering, then at Judge Carver. But this man, Caleb Thornhill, he stood when others would not. He paid his last money. He gave me shelter, food, safety. He taught me to read my father's name. Her English grew stronger with each sentence, conviction burning through her accent. I choose him to stay. I choose him to work this land with me. I choose... She stopped, searching for the right words. Moss leaned forward from the pulpit, his old voice gentle. Are you saying you want him as a partner? Someone to help run the ranch? No, Ayita said. She looked at Caleb, and something vulnerable and fierce moved in her eyes. I say I want him as husband, if he will have me. If he can forgive that his name brings me pain, and I can forgive that I bring him same pain. We both carry ghosts, maybe we carry them together. The church erupted in whispers. Tate started to say something, but Judge Carver held up a hand for silence. That's her choice to make, the judge said. And it's a legal one. If she's the rightful owner, she can choose who lives on her land. She can choose who she marries. He looked at Tate with something approaching contempt. What she can't choose is to be arrested on false charges you manufactured. Those affidavits are signed, Tate began. By men you paid, Doc Pruitt interrupted. She pulled out a small notebook. I documented it. $50 each to swear they saw her steal federal property. One of them got drunk last night and told his wife, who told me this morning. The judge's eyebrows rose. That's perjury and witness tampering, Vernon. Federal crimes. Tate's face went from red to white. You can't prove. I can, Sarah Mitchell said, standing up from her pew. Her voice shook, but she kept talking. I heard you offer Pete Jacobs money to sign that paper. I was in the general store, behind the flour sacks, heard every word. Thomas Garrett stood as well. And I saw you meet with Judge Carver's competitor from Santa Fe, trying to get him to issue the warrant instead when you thought Carver wouldn't cooperate. One by one, the 7 witnesses found their voices, each one adding another piece of evidence, another crack in Tate's armor. The fear that had kept them silent for so long broke apart in the face of one young woman's courage and one old man's determination to finally stop running from his own cowardice. Sheriff Morrison stood, his hand resting on his gun belt. Vernon Tate, I'm placing you under arrest for land fraud, perjury, and witness tampering. You can come quiet, or we can do this hard. Tate's hired men had already disappeared out the door, wanting no part of what came next. Tate himself seemed to shrink, all his power and influence collapsing in on itself like a building with rotten foundations. This isn't over, he hissed, but the words had no strength behind them. Yes, Judge Carver said quietly. It is. As the sheriff led Tate out in shackles, Reverend Moss stepped down from the pulpit. He looked older than his 62 years, worn down by decades of silence and complicity, but there was something lighter in his eyes now, something like redemption beginning to take root. I got one more piece of business, Faiz said, if the lady and gentleman are agreeable. He looked at Caleb and Aita. I can perform a wedding right now, tonight. Make it legal and binding before anyone else gets ideas about interfering. Caleb turned to Aida, his throat tight. Is that what you want? Truly? She took both his hands in hers. I choose you. I choose this. Then, softer, in the language he was learning to understand, I choose us. Outside, the night had turned cold and clear, stars visible through the church windows. Inside, 7 witnesses and 1 judge watched as Reverend Moss opened his Bible to the worn pages he'd read 1,000 times before. But tonight, the words felt new. Tonight, they felt like the beginning of something that might, against all odds, heal the... The wedding ceremony was brief, stripped down to the essential vows that mattered. Moss spoke the words with a solemnity that came from understanding how much weight they carried. Not just the joining of 2 people, but the binding of wounds that ran deeper than any single lifetime. Do you, Caleb Thornhill, take this woman as your lawful wife, to honor and protect, to work beside as equal partner for as long as you both shall live? Caleb's voice was steady. I do. Do you, Aita Naltza, take this man as your lawful husband to honor and trust, to build a future with despite the past that stands between you? Aita's answer came in English, clear and firm. I do. There was no ring yet. That would come later, forged from the branding iron that had marked cattle in the flesh of the enslaved. For now, they simply held hands while Moss spoke the final words, and when he pronounced them married, the 7 witnesses applauded softly, the sound gentle in the quiet church. Judge Carver stepped forward, producing a marriage certificate from his seemingly endless supply of documents. Sign here, both of you, and I'll witness it official. Aita took the pen first, her hand steadier now than when she'd written her father's name that morning. She signed slowly, each letter deliberate. Aita Naltza Thornhill. The last name was new, added by choice rather than force, and Caleb watched her claim it with a fierce pride that made his chest ache. He signed beneath her signature, and the judge added his seal with a solid thump of his stamp. That makes it legal, Carver said. Now, about the land deed. He spread both documents on the table, Aita's charred original and his clerk's certified copy. Mrs. Thornhill, as the legal heir to Chief Naltza's property, you have full rights to this land. The previous sales were fraudulent and are hereby nullified. Your husband may work the land with you, but the title remains in your name unless you choose to add him. Aita looked at the deed, then at Caleb. Together, she said, both names, equal. The judge nodded and made a notation. I'll file the amended deed when I return to the territorial office. Until then, this copy serves as proof of ownership. He looked at them both seriously. Vernon Tate had a lot of connections. Some of them might not take kindly to seeing their schemes exposed. You watch yourselves. We will, Caleb said. After the judge left, with the sheriff and his prisoner in tow, the small gathering lingered in the church. Sarah Mitchell approached Aida hesitantly, then pulled her into a quick embrace. "You're braver than I'll ever be," she whispered. Thomas Garrett shook Caleb's hand with a grip that still had strength despite his years. "About time someone stood up to that bastard." "Begging your pardon, Reverend." Moss smiled. "God's heard worse in his house, Tom." One by one, the witnesses filed out until only Caleb, Aida, Moss, and Doc Pruitt remained. The doctor packed up her medical reports, but she paused before leaving. "You'll need help," she said practically. "Ranch works hard enough with 2 healthy people. You," she pointed at Caleb, "have a bad shoulder. And you," she looked at Aida, "are still recovering from months of mistreatment. I'll come by twice a week to check on you both. No arguments." "Appreciated," Caleb said. When Doc left, Moss extinguished the lamps one by one, leaving only the 2 by the altar burning. In the dim light, he looked at the couple standing before him, this unlikely pair bound together by tragedy and choice and a hope so fragile it might break if anyone breathed too hard. "I failed your mother," he said to Aida. "When the soldiers came, I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I've carried that shame for 16 years. His voice cracked. "I can't undo what I didn't do, but I can make sure no one ever takes from you again what's rightfully yours. You need anything, shelter, witness, a voice in your corner. You come to me, that's my vow, before God." Aida stepped forward and hugged him, the gesture surprising all of them. Moss stood rigid for a moment, then his arms came up slowly to return the embrace. When they separated, tears ran down his weathered cheeks. "Go home," he said. "Both of you, go home to your land." The ride back to the ranch took them through darkness so complete the stars seemed close enough to touch. Aida sat in front of Caleb on the horse, his arms around her to hold the reins, and neither of them spoke. Words felt too small for what had happened in that church, justice and mercy and love all tangled together in a knot too complicated to unravel. When they reached the cabin, Caleb helped her down, and they stood for a moment in the yard, looking at the small structure that was now legally hers. Smoke still rose from the chimney where he'd left the fire banked. The corral fence needed mending. The shed still leaned to one side. Everything was exactly as they'd left it, and everything had changed. "Tomorrow," Aida said, breaking the silence, "we fix fence." Caleb smiled. "Tomorrow we fix fence. And you make ring, from the iron." "Yeah, I'll make the ring." She turned to face him fully. "You teach me more English. I teach you my father's language. We learn together." "Sounds right." They went inside, and the cabin welcomed them with warmth and the smell of cedar smoke. Caleb added wood to the fire, while Aida lit the lamp on the table. The marriage certificate lay folded in her pocket, proof of something that felt both terrifyingly new and somehow inevitable. That night, they slept in the same bed, not as strangers sharing space, but as partners who'd chosen each other despite every reason they had not to. Caleb held her carefully, mindful of the scars she carried, and Aida pressed her back against his chest, finally believing she was safe enough to close her eyes. In the morning, they would begin the work of building a life together. He would teach her the rhythms of the ranch, when to plant, how to read weather, which fence posts needed replacing first. She would teach him the names of plants her people had used for medicine, the patterns in the stars her father had shown her, the stories that kept memory alive. But that night, they simply rested. 2 people carrying wounds that would never fully heal, choosing to carry them together. 2 names on a deed that represented not just ownership of land, but the reclaiming of dignity, justice, and the right to say, "This is mine, this is ours, this is home." Outside, the wind moved through the valley that had seen so much violence and theft. It rattled the corral fence and whispered through the cottonwoods and carried the smell of sage across land that had been stolen and sold and finally, against all odds, returned to its rightful owner. The branding iron still hung in the forge, waiting to be transformed. The fence still needed mending. Winter still approached with its cold demands. But for the first time in too long, the future held something besides fear. It held possibility. And in a cabin on 200 acres of hard-won ground, 2 people who'd survived the worst humanity could offer found rest in each other's arms. Their breathing falling into rhythm as sleep finally came without nightmares. Tomorrow they would forge something new from the tools of oppression. Tomorrow they would mend what was broken. Tomorrow they would begin again. But tonight they had already won the only victory that mattered. They had won the right to choose their own story. Dawn came slowly, painting the ridge in shades of gold and amber. Caleb woke first, the habit of years making him rise before the sun cleared the horizon. Aida stirred beside him, her eyes opening without the panic that had marked her first mornings here. She looked at him, really looked, and something passed between them that didn't need words. "Coffee?" he asked. "Yes, then forge." They moved through the morning routine together, water from the well, fire stoked high, beans warming on the stove. But today felt different. Today they weren't survivor and rescuer, captive and protector. They were husband and wife, partners in the truest sense, working side by side to build something from the ruins of what had been destroyed. After breakfast, Caleb led her to the forge. He'd spent an hour before dawn preparing, clearing the fire pit, arranging his tools, setting the branding iron where morning light would catch it. The iron lay there like a challenge, like a question that needed answering. "You sure about this?" he asked. Ayita picked up the iron, testing its weight. The T branded into its end had marked countless cattle, claimed countless animals as Thornhill property. Her fingers traced the letter, and he saw her jaw tighten at the memory of similar metal pressed against her own skin. "I am sure," she said. "We make it mean something new." Caleb built the fire hot, feeding it coal until the heat shimmered in waves. When the flames burned white at their core, he placed the branding iron into the heart of the forge. They stood together watching it heat, the metal changing from dull gray to cherry red to orange that hurt the eyes to see. "My father told me," Aida said quietly, "that metal has no memory. You can break it, melt it, make it new. Only people remember what it was before." She looked at Caleb. "We remember, but we don't let memory make us prisoners." When the iron glowed the right color, Caleb pulled it from the fire with tongs and carried it to his anvil. He took up his hammer, the same one his wife's father had used 40 years ago, and began to work. Each strike of the hammer rang clear in the morning air. The T flattened, then disappeared, metal flowing and reshaping under controlled violence. Sparks flew with each blow, and sweat ran down Caleb's face despite the cold. His shoulders screamed protest, but he kept working because some things mattered more than pain. Aida watched every strike, her hands clasped tight. She was witnessing more than the forging of a ring. She was watching a symbol of ownership and violence transformed into something that would bind rather than separate, unite rather than claim. Caleb worked for an hour, heating and hammering, shaping the metal into a rough circle. When the basic form was right, he used smaller tools to refine it, smoothing the surface, adjusting the size. The metal cooled from orange to red to gray, and with each cooling it became more permanent, more real. Finally, he plunged the finished ring into a bucket of water. Steam hissed and rose in a cloud that smelled of hot metal and quenched fire. When the bubbling stopped, he lifted the ring out and held it to the light. It was rough. No jeweler would call it beautiful, but it was solid. The metal showed hammer marks and small imperfections, but it was whole, and nowhere on its surface could you see any trace of the T that had once defined it. "It's done, Siris," he said, offering it to her. Aida took the ring in her palm, feeling its warmth, its weight. She closed her fingers around it for a moment, eyes shut, lips moving in words he couldn't hear, perhaps a prayer, perhaps her father's name, perhaps just the sound of grief finally finding its way out. When she opened her eyes, she took Caleb's left hand and slid the ring onto his fourth finger. It fit well enough, sitting there like it had always belonged. "Now you," Caleb said. "I need no ring," Aida replied. "I have land, I have name, I have choice." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "That is enough." But Caleb shook his head. He took the silver cross from her bundle, the one she'd carried through fire and captivity, and threaded it onto a leather cord. He tied it around her neck, the cross resting just above her heart. "This was your mother's," he said. "Moss baptized her wearing this. Your father gave it to her. Now it marks you, not as property but as heir, as daughter, as woman who survived and chose her own path." Aida touched the cross with trembling fingers, and the tears came then, not from pain or fear, but from something like relief, like a weight she'd carried for so long finally being lifted. They stood together by the forge, smoke rising from cooling coals, the smell of worked metal hanging in the air. Around them the ranch waited, fences to mend, animals to tend, a life to build from the ground up. It would be hard work, some days would be harder than others. Winter would come and test them. The valley would whisper about them for years, but they had each other. They had land that belonged to them by right. They had justice, earned through courage and witnesses willing to speak truth. They had a future that was theirs to shape. Doc Pruitt arrived mid-morning with fresh bread and a knowing look. Reverend Moss came by that afternoon with copies of all the documents properly filed and sealed. Sarah Mitchell sent her son with a basket of preserves. Slowly, carefully, The community that had been too afraid to act began finding ways to show support. By evening, when Caleb and Aida stood together watching the sun set over their land, her land, their land, the isolation that had defined both their lives had begun to crack. They weren't alone anymore. They had built something together in the face of everything that tried to tear them apart. Caleb looked at the iron ring on his finger, then at Aida's face in the golden light. "What do we do tomorrow?" he asked. She leaned against him, solid and sure. "Tomorrow we live, we work, we remember." She paused, searching for the right words in English. "We make the land bloom, grow." "Yeah," Caleb said softly. "We make it grow." And in the morning, they would begin. Now, I reckon some folks listening might wonder if justice comes that clean in the real world. Truth is, it don't always. But back in 1878, in that corner of New Mexico territory, enough good people stood up when it mattered that the scales tipped right for once. Caleb Thornhill didn't save Aida Naltzi, she saved herself, with a charred piece of paper and the courage to speak her father's name aloud. All Caleb did was refuse to look away when other men did, and sometimes that's the whole measure of a man, not what he conquers, but what he won't let be stolen in his presence. That ranch they built together still stands, near as I heard. Land passed down through their children, then their children's children. Tate's bank collapsed within a year. Turns out fraud only works as long as witnesses stay silent. Reverend Moss preached another 20 years, each Sunday a little lighter for having finally done the right thing when it counted. Doc Pruitt kept her sealed records, started a whole system of documenting abuses so they couldn't be erased from history. Some say that's how territorial law started changing. One woman with a pencil, refusing to let scars be forgotten. And every morning, from what I'm told, Caleb and Aida watched the sunrise together until the day he died at 81, her hand in his, that rough iron ring still on his finger. She lived another decade past him, left the land to their daughter with one instruction carved into the deed: never let chains be legal again. The lesson ain't complicated. Decency costs something, sometimes everything, but silence costs more. Every time a man turns away from cruelty, he builds the cage tighter. Every time he stands, he bends those bars a little wider. And sometimes, $12 and a stubborn heart are enough to change a life, a law, a legacy. Morning light still breaks over that ranch, same as it did back then. Dust still rises from the valley road. Coffee still steams in tin cups on worn porches. The land remembers, not just the violence, but the repair. Not just the theft, but the restoration. And somewhere out there, some old man sitting on his own porch might remember that courage don't always roar. Sometimes it just stands up and says, $12, she's coming with me. By God's mercy, may we all have the spine to do the same when our moment comes.